It's interesting to
So,
see how purity and care often can get pitted against each other. And there can be an impulse of like, oh, I don't want to associate with a person who is doing XYZ. And so your purity impulse kicks off. And that purity impulse is saying something true, you
hmm
know? But we have to balance it out with ultimately the gospel that, oh, just because their impurity is different than my impurity, Jesus reached out to us in our lack of sanctity. Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
in this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. TJ and I are finally back together virtually. We wanted to have a conversation around Jonathan Haidt's moral framework. He's one of the main authors and moral psychologists who have helped develop this.
You might know him most from his book, The Righteous Mind. This is the first book I read about this theory, at least.
TJ, do we want to start out with just the first few sentences of his book?
Yeah, I think it's a good way to approach it. Yeah.
Okay. So, Chapter 1, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Where does morality come from? I'm going to tell you a brief story. Pause after you read it and decide whether the people in the story did anything morally wrong. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this. If you are like most of the well-educated people in my studies, you felt an initial flash of disgust, but you hesitated before saying the family had done anything morally wrong. After all, the dog was already dead, so they didn't hurt it, right? And it was their dog, so they had a right to do what they wanted with the carcass. No. If I pushed you to make a judgment, odds are you'd give me a nuanced answer, something like, well, I think it's disgusting, and I think they should have just buried the dog, but I wouldn't say it was morally wrong. Okay, here's a more challenging story. I don't know if I want to read this one, but I'll read it. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken, but before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. Once again, no harm, nobody else knows, and like the dog eating family, it involves a kind of recycling that is, as some of my research subjects pointed out, an efficient use of natural resources. But now the disgust is so much stronger and the action just seems so degrading. Does that make it wrong? If you're an educated and political liberal Westerner, you'll probably give another nuanced answer, one that acknowledges the man's right to do what he wants, as long as he doesn't hurt anyone. But if you're not a liberal or libertarian Westerner, you probably think it's wrong, morally wrong, for someone to have sex with a chicken carcass and then eat it. For you, as for most people on the planet, morality is broad. Some actions are wrong even though they don't hurt anyone. Understanding the simple fact that the morality differs around the world, and even within societies, is the first step towards understanding your righteous mind. The next step is to understand where these moralities come from in the first place.
Thank you. So, we in this episode want to talk about using this particular theoretical framework regarding moral psychology, talk about kind of the different moral psychological profiles or intuitions that seem to animate some parts of the conversation around queer Christianity, but especially some of the divisions between what we call A, B, Y, X. We'll focus probably on A and B today, but this is kind of the conversation we want to have.
In today's episode, we're talking a bunch about side A and side B. These terms might be new to you. They're mostly only used in conversations among Christians who are either in LGBT communities or recognize they are attracted to the same sex in some way. Since we use these terms a bunch in this episode, here's a quick refresher, and just skip ahead 2 minutes if you don't need it. So, side A generally refers to affirming of same-sex sexual relationships, including affirming of gay marriage. So shorthand, side A is affirming. There are 3 other common categories people use: side B, side X, and side Y. All 3 of these positions are mostly used by same-sex attracted Christians who are not affirming of same-sex marriage or sexual relationships. All 3 of these categories support a traditional, historical Christian sexual ethic. They mainly differ in how they understand, respond to, and describe their various attractions, identities, and their relationships with their faith. Side X people tend to emphasize sexual orientation change and ministered to gay people so that they would be ex-gay, which is an easy way to remember side X. Side Y folks tend to avoid naming any kind of identity language associated with LGBT concerns, with the goal of not taking on an identity of being gay. Sometimes a useful shorthand is that side Y people would say, "Why would I talk about this at all?" Side B folks are not affirming of same-sex sexual relationships or gay marriage, but they also recognize the usefulness that some find in various words to describe their attractions, without participating in the sexual behaviors that have historically happened with those words. So in certain cultural contexts, they might call themselves gay, same-sex attracted, or use other identifiers while still rejecting same-sex sexual relationships and supporting a traditional Christian sexual ethic. In this, side B contextualizes the traditional biblical sexual ethic. TJ and I take a side B perspective while conversing with other perspectives on this podcast. So, side A is affirming. X is ex-gay. Y is why would I talk about sexual orientation? And B is contextualizing biblical sexuality. These terms are more nuanced than the summary, and the people that are fit in those thought categories. We talk about these nuances in our 3rd podcast episode, so we definitely recommend listening to that if you haven't yet. Okay, on to this episode.
Now, I was sharing with David Frank that in my previous conversations with side A friends, I always noticed they would emphasize certain moral values or intuitions for why the side A perspective was correct. And at the same time, I was reading the Righteous Minds book, and I realized, this Righteous Mind book seems to really show a theoretical framework for understanding the sort of moral arguments or values I was hearing from the side A people, well, also illuminating why my intuitions for how to live the moral life and how they were trying to talk about. They couldn't really mesh well. Of course, there's more to the moral life than just these intuitions. There's, traditions of discourse, there's virtues, there's all of these things. But these moral intuitions sort of provide the soil, I guess, in this theory for the larger moral edifices that we build for engaging life. But I think now we should talk about the different moral values that Haidt and his research group postulate or propose. And then we can talk specifically about what I was hearing from my side A friends and how I would differ.
And what's worth noting that Jonathan Haidt's book, it is particularly, the full subtext of The Righteous Mind is why good people are divided by politics and religion. So he's looking at often political divides, but also religious divides as to how are people approaching their decisions on, these ethical realities in our world, whether that's abortion, gay marriage. You can think of some of the big conversations in the public sphere, refugees. I'm trying to think of other examples, but
even like income inequality would be shaped by this. Environment is shaped by this. Indigenous rights, what indigenous people deserve or don't deserve. They're all. His theory can be pretty broadly applied to any sort of moral issue that human beings might encounter, both personal and social.
Yeah, absolutely. Initially, there were 5 moral foundations that they identified, but they've since updated it with a 6th moral foundation. So we'll include all of those. The first moral foundation is the care/harm foundation.
Care and harm is related to ability to feel and dislike the pain of others. So it's also related to ideas of kindness, gentleness, and nurturing.
The
Okay.
second foundation is fairness slash cheating.
This is about what we owe to one another, or how, and in the theory's terms, reciprocal altruism. So it's about connects to ideas of justice, rights, and maybe autonomy or proportionality.
I just think of a small child being so eager to say, that's not fair. The third foundation, loyalty slash betrayal.
This is related to virtues of being like patriotic or self-sacrificing for a group, like how we support a group or not.
The fourth foundation is authority slash subversion.
This value is connected to virtues of leadership and following, and a set basically is about deference to legitimate authority or respect for tradition or traditions.
The fifth one is sanctity slash degradation.
In Height's work, this relates to kind of the human impulse for disgust or contamination, and it underlies notions of striving to live in a better, less carnal, more noble way, and that we need to keep something separated from others so they can be protected and remain clean, basically.
The sixth one is liberty slash oppression.
This value is about the kind of pursuing being free and also reacting against people who are trying to dominate others and restrict their liberty.
So yeah, especially related to resisting pressure, oppressors, and
Mhm.
anything that might kind of dominate you. So that one is, I feel, picking up steam, and it's probably why it got added because it became notable that it wasn't just the moral foundation of wanting to seek fairness and equity in society, but the language, the moral language that is being used a lot is talking about the oppression that people are experiencing and the freedom and the liberty that they are seeking. And yeah, I think it's a valuable category to add to the equation.
So in Height's theory, all people have these or have the potential to have them. But as we'll talk about more, certain people seem to emphasize certain of these. So maybe that can be a way I can move into my particular how I connect this to side A or side B, or how I did that originally.
Before that,
Go ahead.
should we talk about the elephant in the rider?
Oh yeah, we can, sure.
So, what's really important if you think back to those initial stories, about the dog eating family, and then he describes like people's responses that, you're like, you have these, like, okay, what's your response to that story? Do you think that this is morally wrong? And people have they're trying to reason like, well, maybe, I wouldn't do it disgusting, but I can't think of a reason that I would call it wrong. And you can kind of feel this dynamic that disgust is this kind of gut feeling. And then we have this rationalize. We're like, okay, but when I'm going to talk about it, how am I thinking about the morality, the ethical equation at mind? And Haidt does a really wonderful job. His book is worth reading. Actually, oh, what's his name of the Southern Baptist Convention? He was the president of the ethics.
Albert Mulligan was more, yeah.
Russell Moore. Russell Moore actually has his seminary students read this book because it's just so
Mhm.
pivotal in understanding how we as humans are doing our moral thinking and communicating. And
Mhm.
so he uses this elephant and the rider dynamic. The elephant is obviously so much more massive than the rider, than a person sitting on top of the elephant. And the rider likes to think that he has control. And but in reality, the mass is with the elephant. The writer has the ability to give input into something, but if all of a sudden, something's in the way of the elephant or scares the elephant, that elephant is moving. And then the writer will follow along with that elephant. And then once they understand the situation, be like, oh, that was a good thing that we moved away from that dangerous, from that tiger that was attacking. But in reality, the writer wasn't the one who did. The elephant just ran. The elephant ran from the tiger, and the writer then later rationalized it. So it's this kind of metaphor to discuss our rational thinking about a situation versus our gut emotional response to situations. and that we as moral creatures, as much as we think that we are processing analytically, rationally, having great reasons for why we do what we do, in reality, we are responding to this. We have this emotional response first that actually tells us, don't eat that dog. Not
Mhm.
because you have a well reasoned argument for why you shouldn't do it. You might be able to come up with one after the fact if someone brings up the question,
It's dog. Yeah.
but you are going to not eat it wait with at a you don't even have to think about it. You just know I'm not going to eat that dog because that's someone's pet.
Mhm.
That's my pet. And so these moral foundations, recognizing that these are built into us in really deep ways, and we can talk about them and process them in ways that are helpful. But it's important to know just how gut based these are in a lot of ways. So you'll notice in a lot of right, like propaganda, or man, that's too it can be a loaded word, but just the way, as people are sending out their political flyers, vote no for this, vote yes for this, they'll use words, to evoke that sense of right. This is fair,
Mhm.
this is just, this is bringing liberty, protect newborn lives, protect this something that's valuable and and uh has its own sanctity and dignity. They're using words that evoke your, like, moral gut feelings, not bringing you through a rational argument for XYZ, this is how the numbers work itself out, etcetera, etcetera.
One thing I think is valuable, this theory runs against certain theories that are sometimes common among like European Americans or the West or whatever, that really focus on human beings are just rational agents, like just mental, like my ethics are just products of thought. There's, of course, thinking in our ethical frameworks and how we approach the world, but there's always more than that. And in fact, you might say, at least this theory says, that our emotional resources are first, the emotional intuitions are first, and then we build from those emotional intuitions to talk about why this or that. And in fact, sometimes, like in the West, this produced this thing where there's a way of rationalizing why, oh, I feel disgust at this, but actually, since they're not harming anyone, I don't think it's wrong. So it's a different, the, we have a thought process of emphasizing certain values while minimizing others, even though we still feel that other one. Disgust
Mhm.
is minimized, but oh, like they're not harming anyone. So, okay, whatever.
And so
That's a
that
certain way of being.
that
So,
shows our capacity, like, reason and how we think about this has an impact, on our
yeah,
behavior, of course.
of
It's not to
course.
say that the writer isn't there and the writer doesn't, the whole reason why he writes a book, he's appealing to the writer to understand his relationship to the elephant better in order to help us shape our lives in more helpful ways.
True.
Uh, a classic example I think of, people like, oh, can we really have like purity based morality or just that gut feeling? Actually, his stories do it better. But I think about drinking water out of a toilet bowl. No matter how clean someone tells you it is,
Yeah.
you will not want to take a cup that someone scoops out of a toilet bowl. You'd be like, oh, that's, you can add the rationalization. Well, there's the potential for the bacteria or whatever, but we just have this sense of like, I need to stay separate from that
Yeah.
disgusting thing. And we're not used to thinking of that as a morality thing. We turn it I think in the West a lot,
Mhm.
we make that just like a preferential thing. Oh, it's
Yeah.
not wrong to do that. But Haidt points out that that's we don't do that consistently. We don't make it preferential in a consistent kind of way. And most cultures see that as there being more to that sanctity degradation foundation than just this kind of like optional add-on, but it's actually a very important part of life.
Hmm. I think it's fair to say different culture communities place just like that. We were talking about drinking out of the toilet. This place is more like obviously bad, but sort of just like a bad norm that we don't follow. It's not like moral necessarily in the way that Westerners or European Americans would ever place it. But some culture communities may extend that moral in its strong sense to that, even to that, or they may retract it even further. just away from just these things that we do. They may say, oh, the moral life is mostly about just relationship between people. Or they say, oh, but the moral life also includes cleanliness. Or the moral life also includes reverence towards the sacred. There just be different cultural communities which kind of they construct the pieces in different places in order to talk about what is moral or what is not. Anyways, we could say a lot about this. Perhaps I should shift to the side A story. So we've read we read the six moral foundations that they're proposing in their theory. And as I mentioned, I was talking with my side A friend just at this life when I read this book several years back, maybe 5 years ago. And I would start to notice that my side A friends, they generally, in the conversation, we talk about same sex marriage or same sex sex or side A, side B stuff. Almost always, they would bring up only certain values in talking about why their position was better. And in this particular case, like when we talk about marriage equality, almost everyone I would talk with would either mention fairness, a fairness foundation. It's not fair that queer people do not have access towards Christian marriage, basically, or marriage in a society when it was illegal when it is illegal in some places, or was it previously illegal here in the US? Or they would talk about kind of harm, that this harms people's life. It was also similar for just talking about how the Orthodox sexual position was not fair because, queer people, SSA people, could not access sex in the same way, in a morally illicit way as straight people could, and it just caused active harm. But then they almost never talked about any of the other things: loyalty, authority, sanctity, or I guess you could say they talk about oppression sometimes. I have to say that did come up sometimes, oppression, because they're saying queer people are oppressed in society. But they didn't talk much about loyalty, authority, or sanctity. But when I was reflecting on my own moral intuitions, I realized, well, I think you have certain points, but also at the same time, these other moral intuitions I have seem to be what prevent me from agreeing with you in part. Of course, I also have, again, moral frameworks of how I engage the world as a Christian who's thinking about these topics. And that's part of it. But also these intuitions are also there. And the interesting thing was, Haidt's original research in Righteous Mind, he mentioned how in his research, he found that he uses the binary of liberal, conservative, libertarian. Okay. So he's stuck in a certain way of, there's three of them, but he's stuck in a certain way of categorizing the world, which I'm skeptical of, but he's using this. But he talked about how liberal people in his sample, who we'd call liberals, mostly just focused on care, harm, fairness, cheating in the sample that he did. Whereas people he labeled conservatives actually used all of them at different points. Like all of the different ethical values were coming out in their decision making on the ethical surveys he had. His research on this moral foundation seemed to show that some people who he calls liberals, they just emphasize a couple of values. And this seems to track exactly with these side A people I'm talking with. Whereas people he labeled conservative, they seem closer to me, who is trying to involve all of the values in my moral intuitions and moral decision making.
What's really interesting here is that Haidt, in the process of doing this research and writing this book, he said that he actually moved from left to center, or more center, as he recognized his own gaps in kind of moral reasoning and moral foundations, and began to take more into account and give weight to some of those maybe moral impetuses that he used to be more blind to before he did this research. If you're interested in kind of seeing where you rank on this, you can go to yourmorals.org. We'll put in the show notes, so you can kind of see, oh, how do I line up with other people of my similar, maybe political, religious, or demographic information.
Mm-hmm. Well, just for any listeners who the left, right, center may be questionable to them, left usually means liberal or progressive, which of course is another discourse, and right is usually considered conservative, and middle is considered sort of between the two. I guess when telling my story, it made me wonder what parts of this are kind of what I would call traditional Christianity what more foundations is traditional Christianity attempting to like bring forward in the Christian moral sensibility, basically. And then that made me skeptical of the side A arguments because I saw, well, you're drawing on moral intuitions which seem to have emerged more from Western European Enlightenment liberalism, right? Just like a couple care, because you can read the philosophers of liberalism. They usually emphasize pure harm, liberty, oppression, and fairness. They're less likely to emphasize loyalty, authority, and sanctity in the way that arguably I think the Christian faith does bring forward all of these different moral foundations. So in some way, I thought the Christian tradition is the sensibility of the Christian tradition is closer to what he defines as conservative, quote unquote, than the liberal one, which I think emerges from a different ethical moral tradition. So,
And I think that there's the ability for people to get locked onto just one or two moral foundations in a certain type of situation to the
mhm.
neglect of other moral concerns.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yes,
So
I believe that.
around the, sanctity of marriage, people can get so locked into what we would affirm as a real, that there is a
Mhm.
sanctity to God's design in marriage between a man and a woman, and that is real and should be honored and guarded, but not handled in such a way that that you're not blameless for neglecting other moral concerns just because you held on to one moral concern. But if you are not caring about people who are divorced or who had children outside of wedlock or
Mhm.
single mothers for whatever variety of reasons, gay people who don't find marriage as an easily accessible thing, if you're not caring about them, that's still a moral obligation you have. And
Yeah,
it
100%.
doesn't mean it needs to be to the neglect of one other moral foundation, but you need to be pursuing a whole approach. And I think our listeners will know that, of course, there's no one perfect, and
Mhm.
it is the responsibility for us to be continuing to listen to the moral outcries of people who are different from us to see where are we falling short.
I have a couple of thoughts. So I'm going to put one forward and then we'll see if we get to the second one. First one, we talked about side A and kind of how I've experienced side A. I'm not sure, David Frank, but does that track with what you've experienced with side A people when talking with them about
Oh,
these
absolutely. I
topics?
I just had actually a really great conversation with a friend who grew up kind of in a side A church. And I was sharing about my own life and my own conviction to orthodoxy, my excitement for God's calling in my life at present as a single queer person. And yeah, I just have a general actually optimism and excitement about it. That he said, "Well, while that sounds really good for you, I can't help but think about the harm that this theology will practically do in churches,
Hmm.
that it will lead to people taking this orthodoxy and being homophobic, of holding on to basically the truth of sexual sanctity, and that will lead them to a fearful, disgusting approach towards gay people." And then it led to a longer discussion, which might turn into a podcast episode in the future about the kind of history of homophobia and homosexual morality. But there's a big part to it's really important as we're talking about morals that there's a difference between moral seriousness and a kind of self-righteous moralism.
Hmm.
And so that it how we hold our morals is different than holding morals.
Hmm.
I can agree with someone on the sanctity of God's vision of marriage and sexuality, but one of us could hold those morals in a very self-righteous way that because I have the right answer in X, Y, or Z, that means I'm a good person, that means I can judge other people, and Jesus is rebuke towards us sinners is so important to regularly remember of. Don't be so quick to point out the speck in your brother's eye before
Mhm.
taking out the plank of your own eye. And I think we are all too often blind of the own moral planks in our eyes. We have either fairness right, or maybe we have sanctity right, or we have loyalty right. But then we see that someone else doesn't have what we have right, you know? And so we start poking and say, well, you don't understand sanctity. And then they look at you and they're like, well, you don't understand fairness. You don't understand
Mhm.
justice and liberty. And we just keep pointing at each other at what the other person is lacking without recognizing where we fall short. So in in as we talk about this, TJ and I don't want to be caught in that same trap of, well, look at what the other people are missing in their lens. But in fact, I've been very much benefited by having friends from kind of different in different parts of culture and different types of churches where they tend towards kind of these even different moral intuitions in different ways. And I really want to keep saying, oh, they're leaning on liberty in a way that I'm not used to leaning on it that hard. What can I learn
Mhm.
from them?
Mm.
And but we want to, as a queer Christian brothers, want to offer, if we have side A listeners, to say, consider these other moral perspectives. Um, don't just get holed up in only a few
Just, yeah,
concerns.
liberty. And I think that, and it might explain why the side B people hold their perspective, because they're probably relying on these other values as well in their account of the sense of what God is intending for the world and for people's sexuality. One thing I wanted to say though about your story, David Frank, just so people know, I'm pretty concerned with what your friend is concerned with too.
Yeah,
Like,
I was
I'm
like,
also
that's
concerned with that harm, and because I've seen people we'd call straight Christians who they might be willing to be oppressive or be harmful towards, just they make people's lives harder who are queer, you know? So I share the same concern, but your friend and I, who I just know from you telling me about him, we still come to a different perspective on sexual ethics, you know? Like what the Christian tradition is trying to do in following God. But I also share that concern as well.
yeah, it's
So,
super valid. It makes me think of Martin Luther King Jr. when
mm,
people would be interviewing him and say, "Hey, do you agree with how these people are sometimes, violently protesting?"
uh,
And because Martin Luther King Jr. was a pacifist,
uh,
and but as he's talking to, whatever different interviewers, he took kind of a stance of like, the harms that his people were experiencing were so egregious that it would be an injustice to worry too much about, or to spend too much of his talking disagreeing with their response to it.
uh-huh.
And so in that way, I feel like, oh man, like the homophobia, the real harm that gay or queer, same sex attracted people are experiencing in prejudiced ways, for like, it happens really often. Whether it's a youth pastor getting fired from his job because a parent's uncomfortable with the fact that he's same sex attracted, and it's just like completely baseless. Like, this person
Yeah.
is walking a holy, pure life, loving on the kids, but there's just this prejudiced hatred or uncomfortability with that type of person who's interacting with their kids. And so
Mhm.
we're very prone to it. It makes conversations on morality is just very fraught, to want to stand behind one value, and can make it very easy to neglect how it's impacting how we're carrying those morals in a different way.
100%. One thing I do want to bring as well, and this is a good next step to what you've mentioned. When I think about side Y or side X, I often see them, maybe especially, okay, both of them, I often see them as pretty reliant on purity. Like purity is for them typically the chief or sanctity. Sanctity in the Haidt and his group's terms is usually the pretty key sort of moral intuition or moral framework they're employing. For example, side Y, don't call yourself gay in sort of a general sign of stance that you often have. It's because they want a sanctity away from what they perceive as just like the other, the evil other, or like the bad thing. Like gay is too much involving yourself with sinful others when you're a Christian. It's a sanctity or purity impulse.
Mhm.
I disagree with that particular one that they're employing, that particular move, that particularly strategic reason they're using based on purity, but they're using purity. And side X is similar in that there's often saying, well, like this is so bad, you have to renounce it and become straight. You know, it's a stereotypical side X sort of way of being, or way of thinking. Again, sanctity. Like, so I would, I guess, I would ask anyone who's listening who's kind of from the perspective just to consider, like, how does purity fit in the moral foundations you often employ, moral intuitions you often employ in your own ethical sensibilities and reflection? Because actually, and I'll just say this as a person, I think purity used to be really important to me because I was raised in a Christian tradition which really said, oh, Christians need to be sanctified, like protect the truths of the faith. And I still really care about that. But I think over time, it just that intuition of mine has balanced out with the other intuitions, or I've realized that it's more complicated, or I've seen people who use purity as a weapon or sanctity as a weapon rather than like using it in a way that seems loving.
It's interesting to
So,
see how purity and care often can get pitted against each other. You know, that phrase that people have tried to use to help balance those things is love the sinner, hate the sin.
mm,
Because
sure.
there's that real, like, you see the sin of something, whatever this, you identify as sinful, and there can be an impulse of like, oh, I don't want to associate with a person who is doing XYZ if it's a sin that you can't, you don't have a sympathy for or
Sure. Yeah.
can't
Yeah. Yeah.
associate with,
Yeah.
and so your parody impulse kicks off, and there's something, you know that purity impulse is saying something true, you
Hmm.
know? But we have to balance it out with ultimately the gospel that, oh, just because their impurity is different than my impurity, Jesus reached out to us in our lack of sanctity, lack of holiness, in our degradation, in our fallenness, and loved us. And sometimes people who really emphasize care, they've found it, I feel like it's this kind of efficiency of like, oh, if we just remove categories of sanctity and purity slash
Hmm.
impurity, you know,
Hmm.
and say everything's fine. You don't need to judge anybody by what they do. It's kind of this shortcut to getting to the ability to say there's nothing wrong with you, and I can just go and care for you in your situation. And it tries to cut out the feet of that purity impulse. And I think, like, psychologically, it's an effective, like, way to maybe, getting rid of that purity impulse. But what I found helpful about Heidt's book was to help reinforce sort of like, "Oh, no, that impulse is there, it is actually written in part of into my humanity of what it means to be an image bearer of God, is to have that purity impulse, but to not let it conquer or not let it become overweighted, but that the gospel still drives me." And I think that's actually plays into maybe what I shared a little bit in my own story about getting more associated with the side B community and with using queer or gay labels. That there was probably some of just that purity of like, I don't know how much I want to associate with that.
Yeah. Sure.
But as I actually began to just build relationships and care about people, it was, oh, how could I not? And it's uh it put the purity impulse like kind of in check. N-
Mm,
Still holding it as true that the parts about, same sex as being against God's design for us, that I can still say, yeah, it is right for me to try to have it almost like an impulse to say, oh, that's against God's order. That's not something I should love, but not let that lead to put me in a place of revulsion or disconnect that keeps me from being able to care for people and in personal ways.
Story I have that's I think related is from my African context. I have a relative and a friend. They're both women, both older women, older than I. One is middle aged, one is just a few years older than I. And they're both married in a polygamous marriage. Polygamous means there's one man and he has many wives, or more than one wife.
In this case,
And they're
too.
yeah, and both of the men in question, my relative and my friend, they both have two wives. And my relative and my friend are both the second wife in each of their respective marriages. Now, I bring this up because I can imagine in the US context, obviously polygamy is not socially common, right? Yeah, I think it's illegal and as well to
Yeah,
marry
I
someone
think
more than
so.
one person. But in all jurisdictions, I think it's illegal in the US. But I think people they're shocked, like purity impulse comes strong if they hear like what? Eh? But in this African context, it's common. So well, people think it's wrong. No one in my friend group or my relatives, we I guess for both circumstances Christians, we think it's wrong. It's not like the optimum ideal way to be. But we don't kick them out. We don't constantly harass them. We don't like make their lives harder, you know? They're basically accepted in both the circles as just part of us. So in some way that's
As still a
loyalty.
neighbor or
Yeah, neighbor.
or
I mean they're relatives,
a
but yeah.
family member. Yeah.
Yeah. So loyalty is like a more prominent foundation in this context regarding this situation.
Mm.
Even though we admit we come from a Christian background, this is not optimum, this is not what God really wants, but it happened. And so are we gonna cast them away from us? And I say that because my impression in the US context, watching people engage with queer people in the past who would sometimes bring like a dating partner or whatever with them, a marriage, someone who they gay married their partner, whatever. Oftentimes it'd be more casting out or more like, hey, you failed us horribly. Get out of here. Now, it's interesting because it just shows that kind of what the social norms are really shape what you think is pure or not pure. Because in this African context, a queer marriage between people of the same sex would probably be strongly condemned. But this one is seen as not ideal, but close enough. So it's bad, but it's not so bad that we get very purity oriented or sanctity oriented or purity oriented towards it. We just accept. I just want to say this has really shaped my intuitions towards
Mhm.
side A people, for example, in the US who are in a relationship with someone of the same sex. Cause I'm like, well, I I just have a framework for how purity can fit in when I say, yeah, that's not great. But doesn't mean I'm gonna be like, oh, I'll never talk to you. Or
And I'm just like, I try to think about, like, what would I do if my brother, and his family came over to, Christmas celebration and brought two
uh-huh.
wives? I'd be
Yeah.
like,
What would you do?
like, what would the neighbors say? What would the, my housemates say? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
it's such a, like, so un-American.
It would. The US in like the West in the US, it's not been a common way of relationship for like 1,000 years. You know what I mean? So there's a long history, maybe more than 1,000, but
Mhm.
long history of this. In this African context, it's been around, since time immemorial, as long as people remember. So again, it's matching the social norms of the context. It's not that surprising, but
And
still it's coded as wrong as a Christian.
mhm.
It's Christians. Yeah. So
And so, yeah, I think that's a really helpful example to see, like, our gut reactions can be like, well, they're doing something wrong. And it's like, well, what if, like, what moral reasoning are you, and what are those, like, emotional impulses that are kicking off? What about that is, maybe right and connected to truth? When you actually bring in, like, biblical reasoning into this, and I don't want to get sidetracked here too much, but, I try to have the Bible moderate and teach my moral impulses to know, like, am I
mhm.
giving this too much weight? Am I not giving it enough weight? And because, you can read things of like, oh, there's so much in the Old Testament where it's like liberty and fairness for the poor and care for the poor are really high demands that a lot of
Mhm.
our culture has not given enough weight to.
Yeah.
And so then I look at these, things of like, oh, polygamous marriage versus gay marriage. How does the Bible, respond to them? And I actually see that the Bible's way more sensitive to polygamous marriage. It, the clear guidance on that in the New Testament is that if a man has two wives, he can't be in church leadership, but he's not
Yeah.
excommunicated from the church. He's not kicked out of the kingdom of God. It's saying, oh, that's not the picture that Jesus is wanting to paint of Christ and his bride. And so we
Mhm.
can't let that get put as a model image of what we're going to. And so the church moved away from that over time because they're like, well, if it's not meant for leadership,
Right.
it's not ideal. We don't want to do it. We're not going to allow it. But when it speaks about fornication, when it speaks about disobedience to parents, when it speaks about, uh, fornication being either outside of marriage, and which would include same-sex relationships, those are things where,
Same-sex sex.
sorry, yeah, same-sex sex. Thanks for the clarification.
Yes.
That those things, are threatening your participation in the kingdom of God.
Mhm.
It puts heavy warnings on that, and so I wanna reckon with those realities and give, just as like, okay, drinking water out of a toilet bowl, maybe a little, like
Yeah.
impure, but like not it's not gonna like threaten your like participation in the kingdom of God.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Um, and you can see different ways that cleanliness laws were handled in the Old Testament but sexual sanctity, what are the implications of that? And
Indeed.
yeah, and so having my repentance, and treating of these things to have the proper weight I try to align that in my own heart, honestly, so like I can have in part so I can care for other people well. I don't want to put so much weight on something that it's just so tiny, doesn't have that big of effects, or put too little weight. When God says, no, this is really important, even if we don't
Mhm.
see it, even if it doesn't like click with us, our moral impulses don't kick off, but God's putting a higher weight on it. I want to handle that carefully because, if we're still learning and growing, but I think that God's spirit shapes our moral impulses as we continue to seek his guidance in that and obey him even when it doesn't feel most obvious.
The Christian moral tradition has oftentimes, like, put this under the category of virtues. Like, virtues about shaping sensibilities and habits, you know? And the Holy Spirit is a chief actor in sanctifying people's just virtues. Because virtues are more than just your intellectual thought processes,
Mm.
but they're just, again, the habits of life, the sensibilities of life you bring to pursue God's desire and God's kingdom and God is a person himself. Because sometimes, just as Paul says, we sometimes we feel like divided. Like, you know what's right. You intellectually can say XYZ, but still you feel like there's a division in yourself where your parts of yourself want something else, right? Like, being greedy is wrong, but you desire just to be in a luxurious, like, incredibly wealthy context or situation. Or of course, you know that you
Or
can
you're upset
just.
about the inequity in between you and your rich neighbors.
Oh yeah, another thing, that's true, yes. Or I guess, of course, lust. Like, fornication's wrong, but you do that. Virtue is meant to be that habit formation heart thing which connects all and then brings you towards the good. But see, it connects both. It connect in the Haidt example, it connects the elephant and the rider. Sometimes in Christian discourse, it connects the heart and the mind and the spirit. You know what I mean? Like, it's this bridging factor of all
Mhm.
aspects of however you're dividing the human person. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's always an important conversation in these things. And in fact, it's pretty strongly related to this moral psychological bent, just the virtues we need to exist as a moral being, and particularly as a moral being who's walking in the power of the spirit to live a good life.
We all have blind spots in our moral,
Mhm.
our moral guts, our moral reasoning.
Mm.
And so we need to continue to listen to each other. Down the road, I hope that we draw this out into other conversations as it regards our culture regarding race, ethnicity, the economics. and about how these different moral reasonings play in. And the yeah, I think the one of the best ways, well, number one would be to continue to go to God's word and pray that the Holy Spirit like shapes and can flush out maybe blind spots or weak areas where have been neglected in your own past. And one thing Haidt also really draws into clarity is that, it's not just, while there might be, for whatever different reasons, different siblings of the same family, think about something or feel differently, have a stronger bent towards one. Largely, these things are shaped in community. They're,
Mhm.
you know, all evangelicals had a super strong, like, the truth of sanctity drilled into them. And that even if they're feel like, oh, someone's more empathetic and really leans towards care, they still have a lot of wiring, from their culture. And sometimes that might, in America, we have a lot of freedom to kind of move into different communities, but our our communities and the culture that's embedded in there continues to foster different narratives and different moral priorities. And so listening to people outside of our community or outside of our normal way of thinking is really valuable to be to question what plank might be in my eye and
Mm.
help us see that. And even Rosaria Butterfield, I was just reading her website, and she responds to the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. And she said, I would prefer love the sinner, hate my own sin, because she just knows how quick we are to hate the sin of others. And
Mm.
it's like, if you want to, and I think it was under the umbrella of like, how can I like help the church and the LGBT community? And she was basically just saying, get rid of self-righteousness, like know
Mhm.
your own sin. And there's a deep wisdom there.
Yeah,
Which is,
definitely. Well, I would encourage people to, as we wrap up, or I'd encourage people to take time to, if you just reflect on these different moral values,
Mhm.
check the website out that in our show notes, and just think about it. Think about how you think that these impact your decision making or your intuitions. And if you have time, talk about it with your someone in your life, because they might be able to shed more light on kind of how you're like or what you're like. And then just reflect, how does this affect my interpretation of what I do in the world, or how I read the Bible, or how I read other texts, or how I think about what happens in my church or in my family or in my community or whatever, or how I think about what happens in the land that I'm part of, or in the large social structures I participate in, like capitalism or environmental movements or whatever. Just think about this. And
Mhm.
yeah, perhaps you'd get new insight on how to live as a faithful human person being redeemed by God in the world. So,
Yeah, yeah, and be so quick when hearing different perspectives. I would just commend
mm,
to to take a moment and pause and think, what moral foundations are they using and what's valid about that?
mm,
First, recognizing what's valid. Second, saying, is there anything missing? But it's important
yes,
that we're able to recognize what's true in other people's speech so that we can be corrected as needed, or we're just able to continue to affirm truth and not have truths battling truths, but truths battling lies. Well, thank you,
yeah, yeah.
everybody. We look forward to future conversation, hopefully bringing in other people with differing perspectives, and hopefully we hold up to our own commendations.
Definitely. Bye, everyone. Be well.